own requirements. Mr. President, Slovenia recognizes that this Council is finally moving towards its primary task with regard to the war on Ukraine, ensuring a just and lasting peace. Slovenia has been calling for peace in Ukraine for a long time. We hope to soon continue our work towards a resolution on Ukraine that reflects the views of the countries from the region. Thank you.
我感谢斯洛文尼亚代表的发言。下面我请丹麦代表发言。
Mr. President, for all states, large and small, the UN Charter is more than a promise. It is protection. It is a bedrock of global security. Protection of our sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Protection from a world where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That is why we must stand up against aggression whenever and wherever it occurs. Why we must uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. That is why we have stood with Ukraine for 3 years. For Denmark, these principles are non-negotiable. We entered this council with a promise to stand up for international law. We intend to keep that promise. Colleagues, let there be no doubt, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. Denmark welcomes efforts and shares the ambition to bring this senseless war to an end, for this council to uphold its responsibility. But peace must be on the right terms. Regrettable, today's resolution falls far short of that vision. We need to reject the false equivalence between aggressor and victim. We need to reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We need a peace that is comprehensive, just and lasting, and in line with the UN Charter. Our amendments sought to address these issues. They represented the minimum that we believe we should all support. For these reasons, Denmark abstained on today's resolution. Mr. President, let me conclude by directly addressing the people of Ukraine. Denmark stands with you. We stand by your right to freely choose your future, to chart your own path, to simply exist. Denmark will not impose a peace upon you. We will work with you. We will support you. I thank you.
我感谢丹麦代表的发言。下面我请韩国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. We believe there are two goals that everyone can agree on. One, this senseless and unlawful war must come to an end as soon as possible. And two, we must strive to uphold the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and international law. Now is the time to gather our wisdom and determination to simultaneously achieve both objectives as much as possible. In this light, the Republic of Korea voted in favor of the amendments proposed by 5 European countries, and we voted in favor of the draft resolution proposed by the United States. Although it is regrettable that the amendments we supported were not reflected. This war of aggression, waged by a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, against a sovereign state, and the deadliest in Europe since World War II, has tragically claimed countless innocent lives and caused widespread destruction to the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. And this war is also shaking the structural foundations of the international order and the rules and norms that underpin it. The Security Council adopted this resolution of historic significance today, emphasizing the international community's aspiration for the swift end of the war, while also urging lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. In this connection, we hope that the adoption of this resolution will provide an opportunity for all relevant parties to further accelerate diplomatic efforts to achieve just, sustainable, and comprehensive peace and stability. The Republic of Korea will firmly support all these efforts and also reaffirms our commitment to standing with the Ukrainian people as they persevere over the current hardship and rebuild their proud nation. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢韩国代表的发言，下面我请圭亚那代表发言。
Mr. President, Guyana acknowledges the efforts of the United States aimed at achieving a peaceful resolution to the 3-year-old war in Ukraine. At the outset, Guyana stresses the importance of an inclusive and transparent path to that end, involving all concerned parties. Mr. President, Guyana believes that the resolution just adopted is an important step towards a peaceful end of the war. Notwithstanding, my delegation believes there would have been added value in affirming support for the principles and purposes of the Charter, particularly the obligation of member states to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. This is the reason that Guyana voted in support of the Third Amendment tabled by the delegations of the United Kingdom, France, Slovenia, Denmark, and Greece, since the proposal addressed this important priority, in addition to emphasizing a just and lasting peace. Notwithstanding the omission of this element, Guyana supported the text, recognizing that it is an important contribution toward efforts aimed at ending the war. Our support for the resolution was also premised on the understanding that whatever agreements are made to secure an end to this war will be consistent with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. As we have consistently reaffirmed, there is no military solution to this conflict. Therefore, as the parties move towards implementation of this resolution, Guyana urges the prioritization of dialogue and diplomacy as the only viable path to peace. For its part, Guyana remains committed to engaging constructively with all members of this Council and in any other diplomatic efforts that can secure a just and lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. I thank you.
感谢圭亚那代表的发言，下面请巴基斯坦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Pakistan has voted in favor of the US-sponsored resolution, The Path to Peace. This is in line with Pakistan's clear and consistent position on the conflict in Ukraine and our repeated calls for immediate cessation of hostilities and a negotiated settlement of this conflict. Mr. President, Pakistan remains deeply concerned by this tragic conflict, which now entering its 4th year has already left in its wake immense human suffering and massive damage to infrastructure, economy, and society. Apart from escalating geopolitical tensions, the economic consequences of this conflict have been particularly severe, especially for the large majority of developing countries who have been advocating peaceful resolution of this conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. However, even as the security, humanitarian, and economic crisis has intensified, the pursuit of peace has so far remained largely absent and elusive. A different approach was perhaps required. We therefore support this resolution's general call for pacific settlement of dispute and for bringing a swift end to this conflict in a manner that ensures lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine. This is a process that may be difficult and complicated, as with any such process, but 3 years since the start of this conflict, it is time for such a process to take hold. In this context, Mr. President, I would like to make the following points. First, peace is a common goal. It is through a collective, inclusive, and comprehensive approach that we can best achieve this goal. Second, the UN Charter and its principles should unequivocally serve as the North Star for all member states especially in matters of international peace and security. Pakistan's position on this and other conflicts is based on adherence to the principles of self-determination for peoples, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and non-acquisition of territory by threat or use of force. These principles must be respected and applied universally and consistently without any selectivity or double standards. Third, in today's interconnected world, confrontation and severance of communication cannot and should not be opted as an alternative to cooperation and dialogue. We are encouraged that efforts to bring an end to this conflict have gathered broader support. In this context, we take note of the recent high-level contacts between the leadership of the United States and the Russian Federation. Fourth, the sine qua non of dispute resolution is mutual respect and recognition among the relevant parties, comprehensive understanding of the underlying causes of the dispute, acknowledgement of the legitimate interests of all parties, and last but not the least, political will and sincere commitment from all sides to resolve the conflict. Mr. President, Pakistan would welcome all efforts and any initiative that could help the parties arrive at a pacific and sustainable settlement of this conflict through constructive and inclusive diplomacy in full respect for the UN Charter, international law, and relevant multilateral agreements, and which is at the same time responsive to the legitimate national security interests of all sides. We believe the conflict in Ukraine could have been averted through dialogue and diplomacy. It must be brought to an end now. We earnestly hope that the adoption of this resolution will induce positive dynamics, bring a swift end to this conflict, and lend impetus to an inclusive peace process that yields a durable solution in accordance with international law and UN Charter. Pakistan stands ready to play a constructive role to promote this endeavor in cooperation with all member states, united for this purpose, the path to peace. Thank you.
我感谢巴基斯坦代表的发言，下面请巴拿马代表发言。
Gracias, señor presidente. Reconocemos a la delegación de Estados Unidos el mérito de su iniciativa en la presentación del proyecto de resolución titulado Un camino hacia la paz. Panamá considera como prioridad urgente el fin de la guerra, una guerra que nunca debió haber iniciado y que debió terminar hace mucho tiempo, que ha costado miles de víctimas civiles y militares, billones desperdiciados en costos, desfinanciamiento y provisiones de pertrechos, y que ha derramado efectos globales de inestabilidad económica y zozobra. Apoyamos esta resolución en su llamado al fin de la guerra, porque esta resolución no es objetable por su simplista contenido en sí, aunque el silencio de lo que omite pueda resultar más elocuente de lo que manifestó y por ser tal vez insuficiente. Panamá entiende las secuelas de la transgresión a la soberanía, a la integridad territorial y por razones históricas propias siempre ha rechazado la agresión de un Estado contra otro y el uso de la fuerza o la amenaza como métodos de solución de conflictos, y reconoce la importancia de sanar las heridas con justicia al amparo del derecho internacional. Desafortunadamente, hasta el momento, después de 3 largos años, la solución del conflicto entre Ucrania y Rusia ha sido evasiva y los esfuerzos desplegados hasta la fecha han resultado infructuosos y frustrantes. Pareciera insensato seguir procrastinando y con ello repetir errores del silencio en el pasado. También pareciera insensato ignorar la aparente oportunidad de dar un paso adelante en la ruta impostergable de un camino hacia la paz duradera. En este sentido, exhortamos a que las estrategias de negociación con el objetivo de poner fin al conflicto armado entre Rusia y Ucrania recojan ahora en los acuerdos formales que se celebren términos, condiciones, compromisos y seguridades que se encaminen hacia el establecimiento de una paz que para todos sea justa y por lo tanto duradera, con respeto a los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y con garantías suficientes a la seguridad futura de Ucrania. Señor Presidente, por todo lo anterior, Panamá respalda las recientes declaraciones del secretario general Antonio Guterres, formuladas en su declaración del 23 de febrero de 2025, en las cuales advierte que la amenaza de no terminar esta guerra estremece los cimientos en los que se fundó la Organización de las Naciones Unidas hace 80 años, después de la amarga experiencia de la sangrienta Segunda Guerra Mundial. Nuestro voto a favor de esta resolución tuvo como objetivo contribuir a que todas las partes cesen cuanto antes las hostilidades en el camino hacia una paz justa e inclusiva. Panamá reitera su apoyo a todos los esfuerzos que permitan de manera constructiva finalizar esta guerra de una vez por todas. Muchas gracias.
感谢巴拿马代表的发言，下面请阿尔及利亚代表发言。
شكرا السيد الرئيس. لا يسعني في البداية إلا أن أذكر بموقف بلادي من هذا النزاع والذي لطالما عبرنا من خلاله على التخلي عن منطق المواجهة والتصعيد والاستقطاب وعن وضع أمن وسلامة شعوب المنطقة التي تعاني الويلات كل يوم في قمة الأولويات، وكذا عن ضرورة الالتزام الصارم بقواعد القانون الدولي بما في ذلك قواعد القانون الدولي الإنساني. ودعونا من هذه القاعة مرارا وتكرارا إلى إعطاء الأولوية للحوار الشامل والبناء بين الأطراف وإلى ضرورة الانخراط في مسار تفاوضي جدي سواء بصفة مباشرة أو غير مباشرة بهدف الوصول إلى سلام عادل ودائم في المنطقة من خلال حل سلمي تبنى أسسه على مبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة ويأخذ بعين الاعتبار الشواغل الأمنية المشروعة للأطراف. إن نداءنا هذا كان المعيار الوحيد الذي حددت به الجزائر موقفها اليوم خلال التصويت المعبر عنه، وستبقى الجزائر بنفس العزم والثبات على استعداد لدعم أي جهود دبلوماسية تسعى لوضع حد لإراقة الدماء وتسعى إلى تحقيق سلام دائم وعادل في أوكرانيا كما في المنطقة كلها. وشكرا.
感谢阿尔及利亚代表的发言，下面我请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, мы отмечаем конструктивные подвижки в позиции Соединенных Штатов по украинскому конфликту, попыткой воплотить которые, как мы понимаем, стал внесенный сегодня на рассмотрение Совета Безопасности проект резолюции. Понимаем и логику авторов предложить краткий заобщенный текст. Чтобы поддержать этот в целом резонный подход, Россия не стала предлагать какие-либо существенные добавления к тексту. Мы ограничились двумя предложениями, весьма скромными, но важными в контексте корректной оценки Советом Безопасности украинского кризиса. Сожалеем, что наши поправки не были приняты. Европейские же делегации, что в Генеральной Ассамблее, что и в Совете Безопасности, заняли позицию открытого саботажа намечающихся позитивных подвижек в направлении разрешения кризиса. Они попытались насытить текст несбалансированными, политизированными пассажами, которые никак не могут приблизить наступление мира, но нацелены именно на то, чтобы поставить крест на таких перспективах. Даже предложение действовать в рамках Устава ООН сформулировано лукаво, поскольку из всех его принципов выпячивается только один – уважение территориальной целостности государства. А об уважении прав человека и о праве нации на самоопределение в Евросоюзе и Великобритании применительно к Украине пытаются не вспоминать. Хотя именно их несоблюдение киевским режимом лежит в основе украинского конфликта. Этой подмены понятий мы не могли допустить. Очевидно, что ставшая на рельсы милитаризма Европы сегодня единственный игрок на международной арене, который желает продолжения войны и всеми силами противится любым реалистичным инициативам по регулированию конфликта. Принятый сейчас текст не идеален, но это, по сути, первая попытка принять конструктивный и ориентированный в будущий продукт Совета, говорящий о пути к миру, а не раздувающий конфликт. Конфликт, который имеет очень сложный генезис и не сводится к противостоянию Российской Федерации и Украины, как это пытаются навязать нам сама Украина и ее европейские кукловоды. Видим принятый текст лишь как отправную точку для дальнейших усилий по мирному урегулированию украинского кризиса. Они не приведут к успеху, если не будет восстановлено конструктивное сотрудничество ключевых мировых игроков по вопросам европейской и международной безопасности. Контуры такового прослеживаются в американском тексте, и это внушает определенный оптимизм. Но не будем обольщаться. Партия войны в лице киевского режима и его европейских спонсоров отнюдь не сдалась. И сегодняшняя попытка испортить и извратить американский текст это со всей очевидностью показывает. Призываем всех, кто действительно хочет добиться устойчивого мира на Украине, не дать просроченному киевскому князьку и его кукловодам сорвать предпринимаемые Россией и США усилия. Благодарю вас.
感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。我现在以中国代表的发言。各位同事，对于美国提出的决议草案，以及英国、俄罗斯等提出的修正案，中方刚才的投票立场，体现了我们在乌克兰问题上的一贯的原则和主张。当前，乌克兰问题正迎来谈判解决的关键时刻，我们期待国际社会为推动危机政治解决创造有利氛围，期待联合国及安理会为凝聚会员国和平共识发挥建设性作用，期待安理会的行动能进一步发出推动和谈的和平呼声。任何冲突的终点都是谈判桌。当前，谈判解决乌克兰问题的呼声不断上升，和平窗口正在开启。复杂问题难有简单的解决办法。尽管各方立场不尽一致，但对话总比对抗好，和谈总比打仗好。中方支持一切致力于和平的努力。中方支持美俄两国达成的关于启动和谈的共识。中方期待各当事方和利益攸关方都能适时参与到和谈的进程中来，找到照顾彼此关切、公正持久的解决方案，达成有约束力、所有当事方都接受的和平协议。战事发生在欧洲大地，欧洲有必要为和平发挥作用，共同解决危机的根源性问题，找到均衡、有效、可持续的安全框架，实现欧洲大陆的长治久安。各位同事，中方在乌克兰问题上的主张客观、公正、理性、务实。 中方始终主张危机尽早和平解决，始终按照习近平主席提出的4个应该积极劝和促谈，始终强调各国主权和领土完整应得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则应得到遵守，各方合理安全关切应得到重视，一切致力于和平的努力应得到支持。中方派特使积极开展外交斡旋，同包括俄罗斯、乌克兰在内的有关各方保持接触，还同巴西等国发起和平之友小组，形成支持和推动和平的重要力量。中方愿根据当事方要求，考虑国际社会，尤其是全球南方国家的关切，继续为危机政治解决发挥建设性作用。现在发言名单上没有其他人了，我现在宣布休会。 我宣布安全理事会第9867次会议现在开始。本次会议的临时议程是维护乌克兰和平与安全。议程通过。我热烈欢迎尊敬的各位部长和其他高级别代表光临安理会会议厅。你们的出席凸显了会议所讨论议题的重要性。按照安理会暂行议事规则第37条，我邀请捷克、芬兰、拉脱维亚、荷兰、波兰、罗马尼亚、西班牙和乌克兰代表参加本次会议。就这样决定。按照安理会暂行议事规则第39条，我邀请政治和建设和平事务副秘书长迪卡洛女士参加本次会议。就这样决定。安全理事会现在开始审议议程项目2。我现在请迪卡洛女士通报情况。
Thank you, Mr. President. 3 years ago today, the world watched in shock as the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a clear violation of the UN Charter and international law. This act undermined the very foundations of the international order. For 3 long years, the people of Ukraine have endured relentless death, destruction, and displacement. Families have been torn apart, lost loved ones, and witnessed their homes and entire cities reduced to rubble. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has verified that since 24 February 2022, at least 12,654 Ukrainian civilians, including 673 children, have been killed. Another 29,392, including 1,865 children, have been injured. The actual figures are likely considerably higher. The numbers only continue to rise as Russia's brutal attacks persist across the country. In 2024 alone, civilian casualties increased by 30% compared to the previous year. The war has created the largest displacement crisis in Europe since the Second World War. More than 10 million Ukrainians remain uprooted, 3.6 million displaced within Ukraine, and 6.9 million seeking refuge abroad. Many remain in precarious conditions, uncertain whether they will ever return home. Beyond the immediate physical devastation, the long-term psychological toll on an entire generation of Ukrainians is incalculable. Ukraine is now among the most heavily mined countries in the world. This is a deadly legacy that will take years to overcome, including its immense environmental consequences. The massive destruction of civilian infrastructure impacts millions. For 3 consecutive winters, repeated strikes on the energy grid have left communities without power, heating, or other essential services. Over 2 million families remain without adequate shelter. At least 790 attacks have damaged or destroyed medical facilities. This has put the lives of countless patients at risk, with medical professionals struggling to work under extreme circumstances. In 2024 alone, attacks on medical facilities tripled compared to the previous year. The education system has also been decimated. More than 3,600 schools and universities have been damaged, preventing 600,000 children from attending classes in person. Last year, attacks on educational facilities surged by 96% compared to 2023. Mr. President, over the past 3 years, the conflict has also escalated and expanded, not only across Ukraine, but into parts of the Russian Federation. We have seen reports by local Russian officials of increased civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in the Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions of the Russian Federation due to alleged Ukrainian attacks. It cannot be said often enough. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure violate international humanitarian law. They are unacceptable no matter where they occur. The war's impact is also felt globally as it destabilizes economies, disrupts food security, and threatens international peace. The further internationalization of the conflict is deeply alarming, particularly with the reported deployment of troops from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea into the conflict zone. Moreover, the risk of a nuclear incident remains unacceptably high. A drone attack on 14 February caused a fire in the building confining the remains of the reactor destroyed in the 1986 Chernobyl accident. This incident once again underlines the persistent risks to nuclear safety in Ukraine. Mr. President, the United Nations is committed to assisting Ukraine in its recovery. We continue to work with our humanitarian partners to deliver life-saving assistance. In the past 3 years, over 200 interagency convoys have reached 810,000 people with assistance along the front line. However, without sustained funding, these critical efforts risk being suspended, which would leave 12.7 million people without the assistance they so desperately need. Further, we still do not have access to the estimated 1 million people in need of humanitarian aid in areas of Ukraine currently occupied by the Russian Federation. We recall that international humanitarian law requires the facilitation of rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need, no matter where they live. International humanitarian law also prohibits attacks on humanitarian personnel and assets. And since February 2022, 25 aid workers have been killed in the line of duty and 86 others injured. There have been 236 documented incidents involving violence against humanitarian personnel, assets, and facilities. Humanitarian workers must be protected. Mr. President, the full-scale invasion brought a dramatic increase in the number of human rights violations in Ukraine, as reported by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. OHCHR also documented the systemic and widespread use of torture, including sexual violence by Russian authorities against Ukrainian prisoners of war. OHCHR reports that 95% of Ukrainian POWs and 3/4 of Ukrainian civilian detainees interviewed have suffered torture or ill treatment in Russian captivity. Russian forces have executed at least 71 Ukrainian POWs since February 2022, with an alarming spike in executions since August 2024. And at least 170 civilians, including 5 children, have been executed in areas of Ukraine controlled by Russian authorities, including in places of detention. Meanwhile, about half of the 469 Russian POWs interviewed by OHCHR described torture and ill treatment, mostly during the initial stages of captivity. 26 of those interviewed reported having been subjected to sexual violence. The monitoring mission has also verified the execution of 26 Russian POWs. With one exception, these killings occurred in 2022 and early 2023. These crimes must not go unpunished. All victims of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law deserve justice. Accountability is not optional. It is an obligation under international law. Mr. President, in its only consensual decision concerning Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, the presidential statement of 6 May 2022, the Security Council recalled that member states have undertaken, under the Charter of the United Nations, the obligation to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. The resolution the Council adopted a few minutes ago also urges a swift end to the conflict. Indeed, it is high time for peace in Ukraine. This peace must be just, sustainable, and comprehensive, in line with the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and resolutions of the General Assembly, including those adopted this morning. This includes full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢提卡洛女士所做的通报。我现在请安理会成员发言。我现在请希腊外交部长耶拉彼得里蒂斯先生阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. And I would like to thank the Permanent Mission of China to the United Nations for convening this all-important high-level briefing. Excellencies and colleagues, 80 years ago, the Security Council was entrusted with a unique mission and ultimate responsibility to maintain peace and security and to enact the prohibition of the use of threat and force around the world. A noble task, indeed, which often proved incredibly difficult in practice. Our meeting here today takes place in the midst of multiple crises in the four corners of the world. In all these crises, Greece's foreign policy, as a founding member of the United Nations, has been consistently defined by its commitment to international law and the respect of international treaties defining international borders. Greece condemns as a position of principle any breach of international peace and security effected through military action by any state against the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of any other state. In that sense, Greece's stance on Ukraine has been crystal clear from the very beginning of the war, which now enters its fourth year. It is imperative that we all work towards an end to the suffering and destruction that is taking place in Ukraine. We need peace. The war must stop. We all agree on this, and we commend all efforts to this effect. Yet, it is incumbent to actually refer to international law, to refer to the UN Charter explicitly in the resolution. The truth is that it's not easily conceivable why the amendments proposed by the European members of the Security Council have not been upheld. Who would actually disagree on a wording that would say that the Security Council implores a swift end to the conflict? Who would disagree that the Security Council urges a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace between Ukraine and Russia? Who would disagree that the solution should be in line with the UN Charter altogether, not selectively, and the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states? It's not easily conceivable why we cannot agree on those basic, fundamental principles of international law. And if these Security Council chambers are to be meaningful, we need to reiterate in any possible occasion the fundamentals of the United Nations. This was actually the message delivered a few hours ago by the General Assembly with the adoption of the new resolution on advancing a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Excellencies and colleagues, the country I have the honor to represent today has consistently been an ardent proponent of peace. It is therefore evident that during any peace undertaking henceforth, Greece will support, as best as it can, efforts which could lead to a comprehensive, fair, and lasting peace, and which would guarantee a better future for the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
我感谢伊拉比德里蒂斯先生阁下的发言。下面我请丹麦外交政策国务秘书马孔女士阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Undersecretary Di Carlo, for your briefing, and I also welcome the participation of Ukraine today in our meeting. Exactly 3 years ago, as this Council met in an emergency meeting, as the Secretary General appealed directly to President Putin, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It did so in clear violation of the UN Charter, in continuation of what it started in 2014. Mr. President, what followed was and continues to be a long and brutal war, a war that has caused and continues to cause tremendous human suffering. Hundreds of thousands killed, almost 13 million people in humanitarian need, millions displaced. Attacks on homes, hospitals, schools, and critical energy infrastructure continue unabated. Just this weekend, cities across Ukraine were bombarded by massive drone attacks. This morning, we gathered in the General Assembly in solidarity with Ukraine to adopt their resolution and to confirm our commitment to the United Nations Charter. Denmark voted in favor of that resolution. Indeed, so did a widespread number of member states. Let there be no doubt, and we have said that before, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. Today, the international community reiterated that call for a lasting peace in Ukraine, based on the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is simply astounding that today, in the 21st century, we must fight for these basic rules, fundamental rules that we all agreed to nearly 80 years ago. Mr. President, what is needed is not just the absence of war. What is needed is a just, a fair peace that does not reward the aggressor and does not punish the victim. We must not undermine international law, territorial integrity, or the sovereignty of an independent country. International law and the UN Charter are our strongest safeguard against a world where might makes right. They are principles that all of us have a duty to protect and to defend. They are the essence of the UN Charter, of this very organization. Mr. President, Denmark welcomes conversations about peace for Ukraine, and with Ukraine. Peace talks that can lead to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. We need a peace where Ukraine does not have to live in fear and insecurity. A peace where no one wonders which country is next in line. A peace where the right security guarantees will prevent another devastating aggression. This war was imposed on Ukraine, but it has now first and foremost become about Ukraine's right to independently decide its own future. Ukraine is a European country, part of the European family, at the heart of Europe. Therefore, this war is inherently also about European security and freedom. Europe has been supporting Ukraine from day one, and in Europe we are boosting our support for Ukraine even more. We want to ensure that this harrowing war does not repeat itself in the near future. Mr. President, I repeat the message that you will heard Ukrainian and European colleagues voice on multiple occasions, messages that sadly we are repeating today. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Nothing about European security without Europe. The importance of this message simply cannot be overstated. It's the only way we will succeed in creating a peace that will actually last. I truly believe that this is in the interest of everyone around this table, too. In closing, Mr. President, the suffering can end today if Russia stops its illegal, full-scale war. The people of Ukraine are counting on us. We cannot let them down. They cannot look to the UN and see their futures compromised, their country carved up, their borders redrawn. They deserve peace and prosperity. Let this be the last year we gather at the UN to mark another anniversary of this senseless war. Let 2025 be the year that the war is brought to a just end for good. I thank you.
我感谢马孔女士阁下的发言。下面我请斯洛文尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. And I want to welcome to the Chamber Deputy Minister of Ukraine. Mr. President, 3 years have passed since the Ukrainian people woke to a war being brutally imposed on them. After 3 years of intense fighting, this war must end. Yes, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, it is high time for peace in Ukraine. Ceasefire must be achieved and sufficient security guarantees for Ukraine ensured. Negotiations for a just and lasting peace must be held with Ukraine and the European Union at the negotiating table. The toll this war has taken on civilians is unbearable. Last year, the total number of civilians killed or injured was 30% higher than the year before. This is just one of the signs of how the war expanded and became deadlier throughout the year. In 2024, we have witnessed a number of escalations, including the active involvement of DPRK in the war. In recent months, Russia has launched some of its largest airstrikes, hitting schools, hospitals, energy infrastructure, and residential buildings. WHO reported that the casualties among health workers and patients nearly tripled compared to 2023. Undersecretary General DiCarlo reminded us of the drone strike in Chernobyl as part of continuous air and drone attacks which seriously endanger the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. As the IAEA has been warning for years now, the situation is dire and could eventually lead to a nuclear accident, and its aftermath would be felt across the globe. Mr. President, each day of the war leads to more violations of international law. In the midst of all these, we should never forget that this invasion represents a grave violation of the UN Charter and the very principles this organization is built on. As members of the Council, we are obliged to identify avenues that will lead to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. However, without respecting the fundamental principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, there cannot be such a peace. Mr. President, Slovenia will actively support all meaningful efforts toward peace. We will also continue to support Ukraine in any way possible until a peace deal that brings a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace and security to Ukraine and entire Europe is reached. Thank you.
感谢斯洛文尼亚代表的发言。下面我请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, for your remarks. I also welcome the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Mr. President, colleagues, at its heart, the Security Council's purpose is to maintain international peace and security, including the peaceful settlement of disputes. That is why it was created. That is why we are all here in this chamber. The mural on the wall behind me depicts the horrors of war. Let it remind us of our collective responsibility, above all else, to put an end to war and conflict. Over the past 11 years, we have had countless meetings in this chamber about the Russia-Ukraine war. Against the backdrop of this mural, Council meetings have confirmed the horrors of this war, the deaths and injuries to civilians and soldiers, the countless displaced persons, including children, the destruction of infrastructure, the danger to nuclear safety. The United States, as President Trump has made clear, is committed to ending this war, and he has been clear that we must reach a lasting peace. Mr. President, we are under no illusions. We recognize it will be challenging to get an agreement, but the time for Russia and Ukraine to make difficult choices and end the fighting is now. The United States has been in close contact with Ukrainian counterparts throughout this conflict, and we will continue to do so. In the past week, we have also opened a direct dialogue with Russia. As Secretary Rubio announced following discussions in Riyadh, the United States and Russia have committed to negotiating toward an end to the conflict that is enduring and acceptable to all of the parties engaged. We call on all other UN member states to join the United States in pushing for a durable peace that will bring stability to Europe and deter further aggression. And we are proud that the Security Council has done just that just now in passing an historic landmark agreement on Ukraine, the first such in 3 years. Mr. President, after years of destruction and suffering, it is time for all of us to commit to ending this war. I thank you.
感谢美国代表的发言，下面有请法国代表发言。
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Di Carlo pour son intervention. Depuis 3 ans, la Russie mène une invasion à grande échelle de l'Ukraine. Elle agresse un État souverain, l'Ukraine, qui ne la menaçait en rien, dont elle occupait déjà illégalement une partie du territoire depuis 2014. C'est la Russie et la Russie seule qui a pris la décision le 24 février 2022 de violer la Charte des Nations Unies et de revenir sur les principes que nous nous sommes fixés ensemble au sortir de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, et notamment la souveraineté des États, l'indépendance et l'intégrité territoriale. C'est elle qui a choisi de ramener la guerre sur le continent européen. Depuis 3 ans, la Russie poursuit son agression brutale, illégale et injustifiable de l'Ukraine, au plus grand mépris du droit international humanitaire. Elle mène des frappes délibérées contre les populations civiles. Elle continue de cibler les infrastructures énergétiques. Et elle utilise les violences sexuelles comme arme de guerre. Elle mène des transferts forcés, des déportations d'enfants ukrainiens. Les responsables de ces crimes de guerre doivent être jugés. Depuis 3 ans, la Russie sape les fondements de l'architecture internationale de non-prolifération. Elle acquiert des drones et des missiles balistiques auprès de l'Iran. Elle se fournit en armes, munitions et missiles balistiques auprès de la Corée du Nord, en violation des résolutions de ce Conseil. Des soldats nord-coréens sont engagés sur le front ukrainien en soutien à la guerre d'agression de la Russie, ce qui représente une violation supplémentaire du droit international. Nous tous, qui exprimons régulièrement notre soutien à la Cour internationale de justice, rappelons qu'une ordonnance de la Cour a demandé à la Russie dès le 16 mars 2022 de suspendre ses opérations militaires. La Russie doit mettre fin à la guerre d'agression lancée contre l'Ukraine. Nous voulons tous la paix, une paix globale, juste et durable. Pas un accord imposé sous la contrainte à l'agressé, aux autorités ukrainiennes, aux millions d'Ukrainiens qui résistent depuis 3 ans aux forces russes. Monsieur le Président, depuis 3 ans, l'Ukraine se défend face à l'agression russe, conformément à la charte. Le courage du président Zelensky, le courage de tous les Ukrainiens, force l'admiration et nous oblige. La France continuera d'apporter à l'Ukraine le soutien militaire et humanitaire dont elle a besoin, aussi longtemps que nécessaire, et elle est prête à le renforcer. L'Ukraine, État souverain, doit être libre de choisir toutes ses alliances et son destin. Un règlement du conflit qui se ferait sans l'Ukraine n'aurait aucun avenir. Il consacrerait la supériorité de la force sur le droit et préparerait les guerres de demain. Rien ne doit être décidé sur l'Ukraine sans l'Ukraine. L'agression russe représente aussi une menace directe pour l'ensemble du continent européen. L'Europe, dont la sécurité est en jeu, doit participer à toute négociation concernant un règlement du conflit. Rien ne doit être décidé sur la sécurité européenne sans les Européens. Monsieur le Président, il n'y aura de paix et de sécurité nulle part dans le monde si les agressions sont récompensées. Une paix qui laisserait l'agresseur imposer sa volonté par la force ne saurait être solide. La paix en Ukraine, pour être durable, devra s'accompagner de garanties de sécurité fortes et crédibles pour les Ukrainiens. Le président de la République, Emmanuel Macron, a réuni plusieurs dirigeants européens et internationaux pour travailler sur le sujet. Nous continuerons à avancer en lien avec l'ensemble des partenaires intéressés à la paix et à la sécurité en Europe dans cette direction. La paix en Ukraine, pour être juste, devra respecter la Charte des Nations Unies, ses principes, et donc la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, comme l'a rappelé hier le secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Ce matin, pour la 8e et la 9e fois en 3 ans, et par 2 fois, l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies a condamné l'agression russe et a appelé au respect de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. L'Assemblée générale des Nations unies, universelle, a été ce matin la boussole du droit, de la morale, de la compassion envers les victimes, de l'égalité souveraine des États, de la défense des fondements de l'ordre international. Ce Conseil doit en prendre acte et suivre cet exemple. Il doit réitérer son soutien à la Charte et qu'il n'y a pas de paix que dans le respect, du droit et de la volonté des peuples. Celle du peuple ukrainien doit être entendue. Je vous remercie.
感谢法国代表的发言，下面请巴拿马代表发言。
Gracias, señor presidente. Panamá expresa su gratitud a la señora Rosemary DiCarlo, secretaria general adjunta, por su excelente exposición informativa y le damos la bienvenida a las distinguidas autoridades que nos acompañan y nos distinguen con su participación en esta sesión. Han transcurrido ya 3 largos años desde el inicio del conflicto entre Rusia y Ucrania. Este conflicto, que debió haber ya terminado, implicó una fractura a la paz y seguridad internacionales cuyos efectos han tenido un impacto no solo regional, sino de alcance global, comprometiendo la seguridad alimentaria, la seguridad marítima y la seguridad económica. Panamá, fiel a su tradición pacifista, alienta los esfuerzos diplomáticos y políticos para alcanzar un acuerdo de paz en Ucrania mediante un diálogo justo y franco que permita a las partes recuperar la paz. Los perjuicios causados por el ya largo conflicto, las muertes de militares, la matanza de civiles, el maltrato de prisioneros de guerra y de detenidos en forma arbitraria, el costo multibillonario del financiamiento y de la provisión de armamento a las partes en conflicto por terceros países, los costos económicos incalculables a los estados parte del conflicto y hasta el riesgo de un incidente nuclear hacen que la continuidad de este conflicto sea insostenible. Es desafortunado que todos los esfuerzos desplegados para lograr acuerdos que detengan la guerra han sido evasivos, infructuosos y frustrantes. Resulta claro entonces que la prioridad en este momento sea ponerle fin definitivo a la tragedia sin más procrastinaciones. Por ello, Panamá se identifica con el eco del mensaje claro y contundente expresado por el secretario general de las Naciones Unidas, Antonio Guterres, que en su declaración divulgada el 23 de febrero de 2025 expresó en inglés: "Enough is enough". Señor presidente, Panamá es miembro fundador de esta organización, por lo que desde hace 80 años ha defendido los principios establecidos en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, piedra angular del derecho internacional. Promovemos, por lo tanto, el respeto a la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, al derecho internacional, y por razones históricas propias hemos siempre rechazado y rechazamos las agresiones por parte de un Estado a otro, por considerar que son métodos indebidos para la solución de conflictos. Por el contrario, creemos firmemente en el multilateralismo para hacer valer el orden establecido con base a reglas para prevenir los conflictos armados y mantener la paz y la seguridad internacionales duraderas, siempre apuntando a la resolución pacífica y diplomática de los conflictos. Panamá ha decidido, señor presidente, mirar hacia el futuro y por esta razón hemos apoyado los esfuerzos de los Estados Unidos de América en su objetivo de poner fin a esta guerra con el apoyo de la comunidad internacional. Hacemos votos para que los acuerdos que se celebren de manera formal para poner fin al conflicto armado entre Rusia y Ucrania incluyan términos, condiciones, compromisos y garantías que en forma concreta se negocien con la participación de las partes vinculadas directa e indirectamente en el conflicto y así se acuerden para poder erradicar la guerra y sus devastadoras consecuencias para alcanzar una paz que para todos sea justa, completa y duradera. Muchas gracias.
感谢巴拿马代表的发言，我现在请韩国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to extend my gratitude to U.S. Carlo for her comprehensive briefing. Today marks the third anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and the war continues to rage on. The scars left by Russia's aggression are deeply profound. More than 10 million people, 25% of Ukraine's pre-war population, are now displaced, with around 7 million Ukrainian refugees seeking shelter abroad. Ukraine has lost control of about 1/5 of its territory, and much of the nation has been devastated. Its power generation capacity reduced to just 1/3 of pre-war levels. The core tenets of the UN Charter, largely upheld for 80 years since the United Nations founding, have been severely undermined by a permanent member of the Security Council throughout this war. Furthermore, the security dynamics between Europe and the Indo-Pacific have become increasingly intertwined. In light of this grave reality, I would like to share the following key points. First, we believe there are two goals that everyone can agree on. One, this senseless and unlawful war must come to an end as soon as possible. And two, we must strive to uphold the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and international law. Now is the time to gather our wisdom and the determination to simultaneously achieve both objectives as much as possible. Second, based on the experience of the 3-year-long Korean War, when full-scale armistice negotiations begin, the intensity of the conflict often escalates and casualties on the battlefields surge. Both sides must exercise the utmost restraint, as this is in no one's interest. All relevant parties should take this into consideration. Third, in the process of ending this brutal war, which has geopolitical and economic repercussions extending across the globe, the supporters of the UN's ideals and the friends of Ukraine must remain united. In doing so, a robust foundation for international cooperation must be established, addressing both post-war security and reconstruction. Mr. President, halting this war is not just a global imperative, but also essential for the security on the Korean Peninsula. The illegal military cooperation between Russia and North Korea, in blatant violation of multiple Security Council resolutions, must end immediately. In the mounting desperation, Moscow has turned to Pyongyang not only for an astronomical quantity of weapons, but also for manpower. Furthermore, Russia used its veto and dismantled the panel of experts of the DPRK Sanctions Committee in the Security Council last April, enabling it to conceal this illegal partnership. In return, North Korea is reportedly receiving military support involving arms and technological transfers, perhaps including sensitive satellite technologies. But the danger extends beyond such transactions. Now North Korean troops are gaining real battlefield experience in ways that pose a direct threat to the Republic of Korea's security. In conclusion, Mr. President, as a once war-torn nation, the Korean people poignantly understand the painstaking path to peace and recovery. To support Ukraine's humanitarian and reconstruction efforts, the Republic of Korea provided $400 million last year and will continue to contribute $2 billion financial package over the next 4 years. The Republic of Korea reaffirms its commitment to standing with the Ukrainian people as they overcome the current hardship and rebuild their proud nation. I thank you, Mr. President.
感谢韩国代表的发言，下面请英国代表发言。
Thank you, President, and I start by thanking Under-Secretary General Di Carlo for her briefing today. Today marks the third year of President Putin's full-scale invasion forced on the Ukrainian and Russian people in clear breach of the UN Charter. So first of all, today, of all days, we pause to remember and honour the victims of this war. Those who have lost their lives, their homes, their futures, their limbs, their childhoods, family members and friends. Millions who have been displaced, tens of thousands who've lost their lives. They've lost schools, playgrounds, farms, churches, hospitals, while Russian forces have used rape, torture, and execution as weapons of war and put nuclear safety at risk. This is a war that Putin said would take 3 days. 3 years on, Ukrainians have paid a terrible price. And the impact of this war is not limited to Ukraine. Hunger, poverty, and energy insecurity have increased worldwide. So second, as we look forward to peace, let's be clear. No country wants peace more than Ukraine. Ukraine is more than ready for this war to end. But there needs to be a lasting and a just peace, with Ukraine's voice at the heart of any talks. A peace that is not just a pause in fighting, but a peace that leaves Ukraine secure and free from Russian attack. A peace that shows aggression does not pay, and a peace that ends forever Putin's imperialist ambitions. And we have to remember that Putin, by contrast, only wants capitulation. So if Russia is allowed to win, we will live in a world where might is right, where borders can be redrawn by force, where aggressors think they can act with impunity. The consequences for peace and security around the world are dire. So third, then, a lasting peace must come from strength. Strength and courage that Ukraine has shown abundantly in the last 3 years. But that strength and courage needs to be underpinned by robust security agreements from the outset, because Putin has repeatedly shown that he will break a weak deal. He has long denied Ukraine's right to exist as a free state. So the UK, with our European partners and the United States, will work closely together for Ukraine, and Europe will continue to take responsibility for our continent's security. The UK is ready to play a leading role to support Ukraine in its right to self-defense, to support the negotiation and implementation of a peace agreement, a just and lasting peace agreement which protects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, its internationally recognized borders in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
感谢英国代表的发言，下面请巴基斯坦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. We also appreciate the presence of several distinguished ministers, including Ukraine, and that signifies the importance of this session. For 3 years now, the conflict in Ukraine has caused considerable loss of life, widespread devastation, and immense human suffering, as USG DiCarlo also informed us. The consequences of this conflict transcend borders, impacting the region and beyond. The shock to the global economy was particularly severe for the developing countries. Most ominously, if the hostilities continue, there is an ever-present danger of further military and geographical escalation, which poses a clear and significant threat to international peace and security. It was unfortunate and beyond comprehension that in this age, in today's world, even as the military, humanitarian, and economic crisis intensified, the pursuit of peace remained largely absent and elusive. And that is despite the fact that the vast majority of member states, including the developing world, have constantly desired and advocated for a peaceful settlement of this conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. Pakistan believes that all the peoples affected by this tragic conflict deserve a better future, a future free from fear, violence, and destruction. The international community must redouble its efforts to find a comprehensive and lasting solution to this conflict in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter, to which we remain deeply committed and have always called for their universal and non-selective application. We believe the conflict in Ukraine could have been averted through dialogue and diplomacy. It must be brought to an end now through constructive and inclusive diplomacy. It is encouraging that efforts to bring an end to this conflict have gathered wider momentum recently, including the various high-level contacts. Mr. President, Pakistan would welcome any initiative which helps the parties towards a just, peaceful, and durable settlement of this tragic conflict through constructive and inclusive diplomacy, including all parties, and I repeat, all parties, and others concerned, in full respect for the UN Charter, international law, and relevant multilateral agreements, and which is responsive to the legitimate national security interests of all sides. It is in that spirit that Pakistan has supported Resolution 2774 that we have just adopted. We hope this resolution, the first by this Council in 3 years, will finally provide a path to peace. The pursuit of peace is a collective responsibility that must transcend geopolitical divides. We hope this Council will shoulder its responsibility and unite behind this objective. I thank you.
感谢巴基斯坦代表的发言。我现在请圭亚那代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her insightful briefing and welcome the participation of the distinguished Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, other ministers and high-level officials in today's meeting. Mr. President, for the past 3 years, 24th of February has represented a dark moment in history with the invasion by Russia of the territory of Ukraine. This action was a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Regrettably, the Security Council was unable to prevent this invasion, and even after meeting in this chamber 119 times since the war began, has been unable to take action to end it. For its part, Guyana has underscored the suffering caused to the people of Ukraine and the Russian Federation as a result of the invasion. We have outlined the growing humanitarian needs, called for human rights violations to cease and for the Russian Federation to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. We have also called for respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Above all, we have called for peace, for this war to end through dialogue and diplomacy, premised on the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. We make these calls again today. Today, after 3 years, there is a glimmer of hope. The Security Council has taken action for the first time, laying the foundation for peace. We underscore that a sustainable peace must be a just peace. With this in mind, and against the backdrop of widening humanitarian needs on the ground, Guyana calls upon the conflict parties to heed the call of the UN General Assembly, made in its resolutions adopted this morning. We also call on the parties to abide by the decision just taken by this Council and to bring this conflict to an end. We caution against waiting for all conditions to be perfect before commencing the discussion on the terms for peace. At the same time, we underscore that lasting and sustainable peace cannot be achieved at the expense of justice and international law. We urge the parties to commit themselves to achieving a lasting peace based on these tenets. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana stands ready to work with all members of the Council and the wider international community to bring the war in Ukraine to a peaceful end and to find a sustainable solution. I thank you.
感谢圭亚那代表的发言，请阿尔及利亚代表发言。
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أود بداية أن أشكر وكيلة الأمين العام السيدة روزماري دي كارلو على إحاطتها القيمة. سيد الرئيس، منذ بداية ولايتنا في هذا المجلس لم تمر مناسبة إلا وشددنا على أن استمرار التصعيد ليس مجديا ولا يمنح السلام لأي من الأطراف. كما أكدنا دوما على أن منطق الاستقطاب لن يؤدي إلا إلى تفاقم التوترات وإبعادنا عن أي أفق لتحقيق سلام مستدام في المنطقة. وعليه وبهذه المناسبة المفصلية نود أن نؤكد اليوم على النقاط التالية. أولا، لقد حان الوقت لبذل الجهود الدبلوماسية اللازمة للتخفيف من حدة التوترات بين الطرفين حتى نتمكن في أقرب وقت ممكن من وضع حد للخسائر في الأرواح ومعاناة الشعوب. فكما أكدنا سابقا، لقد أثبت الوقت أن منطق القوة والمواجهة لن يفضي إلى حل للنزاع، فلنسمح في المرحلة القادمة بإعطاء فرصة حقيقية للدبلوماسية لتظهر فعاليتها. ثانيا، نجدد دعوتنا للأطراف المعنية للتخلي عن منطق التصعيد والانخراط في حوار شامل وبناء وبحسن نية، حيث ينبغي لهذا الحوار أن يضع أمن وسلامة شعوب المنطقة نصب أولوياته، وأن يرمي إلى تسوية سلمية عادلة ودائمة لهذا النزاع تفضي إلى حل تبنى أسسه على مقاصد ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، ويأخذ بعين الاعتبار الشواغل الأمنية المشروعة للطرفين. وفي هذا الصدد نسجل بارتياح الديناميكية الجديدة التي شهدناها في الأيام القليلة الماضية، الرامية لإطلاق حوار سياسي يهدف لإنهاء الحرب. ثالثا وأخيرا، ينبغي على المجتمع الدولي العمل أكثر وتكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية لتقريب وجهات نظر الأطراف المعنية وضمان عملية سياسية شاملة لإنهاء هذه الأزمة. فبالإرادة السياسية الحقيقية وفضائل الدبلوماسية والحوار الشامل والبناء يمكننا تحقيق تقدم ملموس وحل مقبول من الطرفين. وستبقى الجزائر مستعدة سواء من خلال عضويتها في مجلس الأمن أو من خلال نشاطاتها الدبلوماسية الثنائية والمتعددة الأطراف لدعم أي جهود قد تفضي إلى وضع حد لمعاناة شعوب المنطقة وإنهاء الحرب بصفة سلمية ومستدامة. وشكرا.
感谢阿尔及利亚代表的发言，下面请塞拉利昂代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for a comprehensive briefing. Sierra Leone welcomes the participation of the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in this important meeting. At this critical juncture in the devastating conflict, Sierra Leone reiterates its urgent call for good faith diplomatic efforts by both the Russian Federation and Ukraine to resolve the conflict. This must include the immediate cessation of hostilities, the implementation of a ceasefire, the full withdrawal of all forces, and unwavering support for the rights, dignity, and future well-being of civilians. The human cost of this conflict are tragic. Since February 2022, approximately 41,000 women and children have been killed or injured. Widespread destruction has decimated essential civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, markets, and water and energy facilities. An estimated 12.7 million people in Ukraine are in desperate need of food, clean water, shelter, and heat during the winter, with most of them having lost their loved ones and livelihoods. The risk to lives remain alarmingly high, compounded by reports of unexploded ordnance covering approximately 30% of Ukrainian territory. In response to this dire situation, we earlier voted in favor of Resolution 2774, draft resolution proposed by the United States. Although we had concerns about the process and the potential for the instrumentalization of the UN and this Council, our vote in favor reflects our belief that Ukraine must be at the forefront of any peace process or agreement, in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter, and that the legitimate concerns of all parties must be addressed. Through our vote, and since the onset of the conflict, we have spoken with clarity to affirm the UN Charter principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-use of force, as well as the peaceful settlement of disputes. These are not mere aspirations, but they are the legal and moral foundations upon which our collective security rests. Any erosion of these principles threatens not only Ukraine in this context, but also every member state, particularly smaller nations whose security depends on adherence to international law. As an elected member of this Council, Sierra Leone reaffirms its commitment to upholding the principles of the UN Charter and supporting all efforts towards a just, sustainable, and comprehensive peace. This conflict must not be allowed to persist into a fourth year. The path forward must be one of peace through diplomacy. The scale of suffering caused by this conflict compels this Council to explore every possible avenue to not only direct our efforts towards the path of peace, but implement Resolution 2774, and also ensure that millions of civilians can safely return to their homes, rebuild their lives and their communities. Noting the urgent need for an immediate cessation of hostilities and lasting peace, Sierra Leone underscores the following 3 points. First, Efforts to achieve peace must involve the good faith participation of all relevant stakeholders, including both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Only with such engagement can we reach a viable and legitimate political solution. We acknowledge the ongoing efforts of member states in this regard and emphasize the importance of aligning political and diplomatic actions towards this end. Due consideration must be given to the active roles of the external actors in supporting the peace process and its outcome, including the provision of any peace agreements. Given the critical role of regional efforts in addressing conflicts of this nature, Sierra Leone believes that any initiative to end the conflict in Ukraine must include the involvement of key European partners, whose positions are integral to securing the long-term stability of the region. We also encourage constructive engagement with international partners who have contributed positively to actions such as prisoner of war exchanges and efforts towards de-escalation. Moreover, we stress the importance of ensuring that women and youth are given a meaningful role in the peace process, particularly in decision-making concerning reconstruction and recovery efforts in both Russia and Ukraine. Mr. President, I now turn to my second and most crucial point, the integral role of the Security Council in establishing legitimate guarantees for lasting peace. Given the history of challenges surrounding territorial and sovereignty issues, as well as security concerns in this conflict, the Security Council must play a pivotal role in safeguarding any peace agreement. This requires clear actions and objectives to be implemented in phases, particularly concerning national military capacities and armaments, regional security arrangements, bilateral defense cooperation, and the recognition of fixed borders. The Security Council must legitimize and support practical actions and compromises that are consistent with the principles of the UN Charter and guided by the decisions of the General Assembly and previous resolutions of the Council, including General Assembly Resolution, Security Council Resolution 2625, 2417, and 2573, which emphasize the protection of civilian lives and infrastructure. In promoting lasting peace, the Security Council should also utilize its mechanisms to monitor and enforce ceasefires and other outcomes. Third, the peace process must address the humanitarian crisis caused by this conflict, prioritizing the swift resolution of its most urgent aspects. An immediate cessation of hostilities is necessary to ensure the full protection of civilians, allowing them to live safely in their homes, attend school, and access markets and hospitals without fear of being killed or injured by attacks. The conflicting parties must cease their attacks on critical civilian infrastructure, especially energy infrastructure, which pose risks to regional and global security. Humanitarian aid must be allowed unhindered access across Ukraine and Russia, including to those in isolated or hard-to-reach areas. Furthermore, children forcibly removed or abducted from their homes in Ukraine must be returned to their families and communities. We also emphasize the importance of adherence to international law, particularly international humanitarian law, in the treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Sierra Leone commends the successful exchanges of POWs in the past and urged the release of all POWs and civilian detainees. We fully support calls for prompt, impartial, and effective investigations into all alleged violations of international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, especially those that result in excessive harm to civilians. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call on the parties to this conflict to do all they can to reach a peaceful resolution. They must seek practical compromises that balance their immediate and long-term national interests and priorities in line with Article 33 of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
感谢塞拉利昂代表的发言，下面请索马里代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin by thanking USG DiCarlo for her briefing and welcome the representative of the region to this meeting. My delegation voted in favor of the draft resolution, The Path to Peace, and extends its appreciation to the United States for tabling this important initiative. We commend this timely effort to address the ongoing conflict between Russian Federation and Ukraine. As the international community observes with deep concern the third anniversary of the situation in Ukraine, my delegation wishes to express its profound solidarity with those affected by the ongoing crisis. The present circumstances underscore the paramount importance of the collective diplomatic engagement. Mr. President, my delegation expresses its profound concern regarding the devastating humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. The relentless conflict continues to exert an unbearable toll on civilian populations, destroying homes, separating families, and shattering communities. We witness with great distress the ongoing displacement of civilians, the destruction of critical infrastructure, and the severe disruption to essential services that sustain civilian life. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate, leaving an indelible mark on generations of civilians who bear the brunt of this crisis. In this context, my delegation calls upon all concerned parties to uphold their obligation under international humanitarian law, with particular emphasis on the protection of civilian and civilian infrastructure. The facilitation of unimpeded humanitarian access remains of paramount importance. My delegation maintains the firm conviction that there can be no military solution to the present situation. A resolution can only be achieved through diplomatic means. In this regard, we call for the cessation of hostilities and the pursuit of dialogue addressing the concerns of all parties in accordance with established international principles. Drawing from our national experience, my delegation fully appreciates the complexities inherent in achieving peace and reconciliation through diplomatic channels. We encourage all parties to demonstrate the necessary political will to engage in meaningful dialogue. My delegation notes with interest the diplomatic engagement that took place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, between the delegations of the United States and the Russian Federation regarding the situation in Ukraine, and support all diplomatic initiatives that may contribute to de-escalation, dialogue, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Mr. President, my delegation wishes to echo the Secretary General's appeals regarding the cessation of hostilities. We reaffirm the fundamental importance of a strict adherence to the purposes and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, particularly regarding the peaceful settlement of disputes and the respect for territorial integrity. Somalia remains steadfastly committed to working towards the pursuit of a peaceful resolution. It's through our collective diplomatic endeavors that we may achieve the shared objectives of establishing just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
感谢索马里代表的发言，下面我请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, сегодня мы опять видим в этом зале по правилу 37 внушительный десант группы поддержки Украины из Европы, состоящую из так называемых министров, так называемых иностранных дел, имена которых я не успеваю запоминать. Да и, откровенно говоря, господин председатель, не стремлюсь. Радует лишь постоянство наших польских соседей. Радослава Сикорского мы хорошо помним, особенно по его многозначительному твиту «Thank you, USA» после диверсии на северных потоках. Сегодня эти министры будут зачитывать свои под копирку написанные выступления и демонстрировать своим телезрителям несгибаемую поддержку Украины до последнего украинца. Вам бы свои дела привести в порядок и в вашем прекрасном саду провести уборку. Там ведь пронесся геополитический ураган и повалил многие ваши прекрасные деревья. Господин председатель, воспринимаем сегодняшнее заседание как неприкрытую попытку сорвать наметившиеся позитивные процессы, способные в самое ближайшее время привести к долгосрочному и устойчивому урегулированию украинского кризиса. Мы получили лишний повод убедиться в том, что режим в Киеве и его спонсоры в европейских столицах заинтересованы не в мире, а в продолжении войны до последнего украинца. А между тем, в результате недавних российско-американских контактов на высшем и высоком уровне лед, как говорится, тронулся. Не менее важно также и то, что в последнее время, благодаря новой незашоренной линии администрации Дональда Трампа, стали открываться подробности того, что на самом деле происходило и происходит на Украине при Зеленском. Полагаем, что многим стало гораздо понятнее также, почему украинский кризис 3 года назад все-таки перешел в фазу вооруженного конфликта, несмотря на все многолетние, настойчивые и последовательные попытки России избежать этого сценария. Все в мире узнали, в частности, что весь антироссийский проект Украины, как мы неоднократно и заявляли в этом зале, с самого начала финансировался Западом. Обнажило эту нелицеприятную ситуацию прекращение деятельности Американского агентства по международному развитию, которое, как выяснилось, с 21 по 24 год потратило на Украину 30,6 миллиарда долларов, или 21% всех своих трат за рубежом. Помощь USAID в 2024 году равнялась 3% ВВП Украины. Самостоятельной Украины попросту не существовало и не существует. Агентство оплачивало деятельность украинского государственного аппарата, а также готовило украинских судей и оказывало прямое влияние на судебную систему Украины. За счет американского финансирования работал украинский парламент, Верховная Рада. 25 миллионов долларов было выделено USAID на публичные мероприятия и работу секретариатов парламентских комиссий. Вот, оказывается, как выглядит точный перевод украинского слова «незалежность», то есть независимость. Поняли мы и реальную цену свободы слова на Украине. Как выяснилось, до 90% украинских СМИ финансировались через USAID. Через него также было потрачено около 5 миллионов долларов на привлечение так называемых лидеров общественного мнения в соцсетях. Оно же заплатило десятки миллионов долларов американским и мировым знаменитостям, которые приезжали на Украину и высказывались в поддержку киевского режима. Поэтому вся эта картинка, заставившая многих поверить во всемирную популярность бывшего комика, оказалась насквозь лживой. При этом скупать Украину и формировать ее политический ландшафт агентство начало задолго до событий трехлетней давности. Так, USAID выделил более 100 тысяч долларов на финансирование телевизионного шоу, способствовавшего победе Зеленского на выборах 2019 года. Сразу же после этого финансировавшиеся агентства организации запретили Зеленскому поддерживать Украинскую православную церковь, проводить референдум о формате переговоров с Донбассом и принципам мирного урегулирования, пересматривать закон о языке, реабилитировать и возвращать политику в эпохе Януковича, восстанавливать доступ к российскому телевидению. Зная все это, не приходится удивляться, почему избранный 3/4 избирателей Зеленский моментально отказался от своих предвыборных обещаний о мире на востоке страны, защите русского языка и налаживании отношений с Россией. Те, кто купили его страну с потрохами, попросту запретили ему делать это. Господин председатель, хотели бы в этом контексте привлечь внимание коллег к одному аспекту того, как USAID беззастенчиво формировала политический ландшафт в Киеве. На прошлой неделе американский юрист Амстердам рассказал о прямой причастности Госдепартамента и агентства к созданию раскольнической так называемой православной церкви Украины. Схизматик. Делалось это крайне цинично, фактически без оглядки на какие бы то ни было демократические ценности. Эти признания лишний раз проиллюстрировали, как усилиями беспринципных чиновников религия на Украине была по сути низведена до инструмента борьбы с политическими противниками. Далеко не последнюю роль в этом процессе, как выясняется, сыграли тогдашний глава ЦРУ и специальный посланник по вопросам свободы вероисповедания, которые не просто закрывали глаза на вопиющие нарушения прав верующих, произвольные аресты священнослужителей и насильственные захваты храмов на Украине, но и всячески поощряли их. Более того, вашингтонские эмиссары колесили по всему региону Ближнего Востока и Северной Африки, принуждая поместные православные церкви признать незаконную, неканоническую православную церковь Украины. Нам теперь доподлинно известно, что в ход шли все средства, имеющиеся в арсенале байденовской дипломатии. Шантаж, угрозы, давление и выкручивание рук. Одержимые стремлением уничтожить каноническую украинскую православную церковь и разрушить единство православных прихожан России и Украины, они меньше всего переживали из-за того, что их действия подрывали свободу вероисповедания на Украине. Как вы все помните, мы неоднократно в этом зале привлекали внимание Совета к ситуации вокруг репрессий против канонического православия на Украине. В ответ слышали лишь заезженные мантры о российской пропаганде. Вы сегодня будете их повторять, или же у вас хватит мужества хотя бы выразить озабоченность этой информацией? Отрадно, что приход к власти в США администрации Трампа позволил начать высказываться тем экспертам, которые раньше такой возможности были лишены, поскольку их оценки ситуации на Украине, в том числе религиозные, шли вразрез с общезападным мейнстримом. Вице-президент Джей Ди Венс публично осудил преследование УПЦ, а группа республиканцев в Конгрессе потребовала начать расследование вмешательства американских структур в религиозные процессы Украины. Считаем это очень важным, пусть и запоздалым развитием событий. Господин председатель, при предыдущем хозяине Белого дома и его киевским подопечным все сходило с рук, даже убийство американских граждан. На прошлой неделе, благодаря бывшему депутату Верховной Рады Александру Дубинскому, содержащемуся, как известно, под стражей, скрылись новые детали смерти в застенках киевского режима независимого американского журналиста Гонсало Лира. В наших выступлениях мы опять-таки неоднократно привлекали внимание коллег по СБ к его трагической гибели, апеллировали к необходимости добиваться уважения киевским режимом прав человека и базовых свобод. Все тщетно. Вы оставались глухи к судьбе Гонсало Лиры и десятков тысяч других политических заключенных на Украине. А ведь в тот момент его еще можно было спасти, если бы администрация Байдена хотя бы что-то для этого сделала. Как следует из личной переписки покойного американского блогера, который располагает Дубинский, сотрудники службы безопасности Украины не только избивали Лиру, но и вымогали у него деньги, когда он содержался в Харьковском следственном изоляторе. После получения от него $70 000 побои и издевательства лишь усилились. В украинском реестре судебных решений имеется решение Дзержинского районного суда Харькова от января 2024 года, на заседании которого адвокат Лиры попросил перевести его под домашний арест по медицинским соображениям. Но прокуратура, представители СБУ, судьи, медицинская часть Харьковского СИЗО продолжали в один голос утверждать, что его жизни ничего не угрожает. Буквально через несколько недель его не стало, поскольку ему не была оказана своевременная медицинская помощь от полученных травм и избиений. Все документы, свидетельствующие о вымогательстве со стороны силовиков службы безопасности Украины, имеются. Уважаемые коллеги, я хочу особо акцентировать, что жизнь Гонсало Лиры стоила именно публикации критических по отношению к клике Зеленского и администрации Байдена объективных материалов. Именно за это он был до смерти замучен по приказу Зеленского. И никто из официальных лиц на Западе, в том числе в США, не сказал тогда ни слова по этому поводу. Они не нашли в себе мужества не только на то, чтобы осудить это очередное преступление киевского режима, но и даже на то, чтобы хоть как-то прокомментировать этот случай. Западные политики, как и наши западные коллеги по Совету Безопасности, просто сделали вид, что ничего не произошло. И принялись с удвоенной силой, чтобы перебить информационный фон, обвинять Россию в агрессии, заверяя в неизменности поддержки киевского режима. Иначе говоря, команда экс-президента Байдена восприняла смерть американского гражданина как не более чем сопутствующий ущерб. А ведь таких случаев в отношении оппозиционно настроенных к режиму Зеленского украинских граждан десятки, если не сотни тысяч. На прошлом нашем заседании мы уже рассказали о том, как в 2022 году сотрудники СБУ пытали депутата Верховной Рады Артема Дмитрука, пытаясь выбить из него показания и признание в государственной измене. Призываем всех, кто еще продолжает защищать режим Зеленского, осознать, наконец, что концентрационные лагеря и секретные тюрьмы СБУ, в которых измывались над неугодными, а потом убивали их, не досужий вымысел или изобретение российской пропаганды. Это та реальность, в которой вынуждены жить украинцы сегодня. К сожалению, Гонсало Лири мы с вами сегодня уже не поможем, но еще можем способствовать вызволению всех тех, кто незаконно по надуманным обвинениям удерживается украинской кликой. Призываем все ответственные правительства, международные структуры выступить с осуждением преступных действий Зеленского и потребовать освобождения всех тех, кто еще жив и еще может бороться за правду. В их числе 70-летняя правозащитница Елена Бережная, о которой мы не единожды упоминали на заседаниях Совета Безопасности. Требовать освобождения Елены и многих других, подвергающихся незаслуженному преследованию и пыткам, наш с вами долг. Если вы этого не понимаете и готовы по политическим соображениям закрыть глаза на преступления киевского режима, тогда грош цена вашим причитаниям о важности свободы слова и соблюдения прав человека, которые вы ставите во главу угла во всех, без исключения, других ситуациях. Господин председатель, в своих выступлениях в этом зале мы также неоднократно обращали внимание на зашкаливающую коррупцию на Украине, которая при Зеленском пронизала все общество. Указывали на героизацию тех, кто ответственен за гибель сотен тысяч евреев, поляков, русских, цыган и украинцев в годы Второй мировой войны. Приводили данные о массовом нарушении прав человека. Высвечивали примеры откровенного воровства западной помощи, перепродажи на черном рынке поступающего из США и Европы оружия. Указывали на нелегитимность киевского главаря, растоптавшего Конституцию своей страны ради того, чтобы удержаться у власти. Сегодня обо всем об этом мы можем услышать от высокопоставленных американских политиков и прочитать в западных СМИ. Это, конечно, обнадеживает. Возрастают шансы на то, что человек, спровоцировавший переход украинского кризиса в горячую фазу, поправший базовые украинские законы, предавший интересы своей страны, отказавшийся от реалистичных сценариев мирного регулирования конфликта и утопивший свою страну в крови ради собственной выгоды и наживы, все-таки понесет заслуженное наказание. И пусть сегодня западноевропейские спонсоры режима Зеленского по-прежнему пытаются его выгораживать и сваливать всю вину за украинский кризис на Россию, приписывая все мыслимые и немыслимые преступления и, разумеется, не замечая ничего того, что позволяет себе творить киевский режим, покрывая своего обанкротившегося вороватого клиента. Как это показало сегодняшнее голосование в этом зале по американскому проекту резолюции, делать это им становится все сложнее. Потому что факты говорят совсем не в их пользу. И этих нелицеприятных для киевского режима и его кукловодов фактов становится известно все больше и больше. Призываем тех в Европе, кто еще сохранил здравый смысл, и кто может найти в себе смелость дистанцироваться от преступлений клики Зеленского, сделать это как можно скорее, пока она, как это предсказывал пророчески президент Польши Анджей Дуда, не утащит всех тех, кто ее поддерживает, на дно. Благодарю вас.
感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。我现在请乌克兰外交部副部长别查女士阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Chinese presidency for convening this meeting. I'm also grateful for Undersecretary General DiCarlo for her briefing. At the outset, I would like to express our profound gratitude to all UN member states that just hours ago supported the relevant UN General Assembly resolution and demanded on the third anniversary of full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine swift achieving of comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine consistent with the UN Charter. At the same time, we cannot say the same regarding the UN Security Council resolution. In our view, this document lacks basics. It lacks the qualification of the war as an aggressor of one member state against another member state. It also doesn't reflect the core principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Mr. President, 3 years ago, Russia started a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. 3 years of Ukraine's fight for freedom, for our independence, but also for the freedom of the entire democratic world. Today, more than 600,000 Russian troops are deployed on our territory, 3 times the number that invaded in 2022. Despite all odds, Ukraine's defense forces continue to stand firm, even as the disparity in military strength remains stark. This disparity exists because since regaining independence in 1991, Ukraine has consistently pursued disarmament, reducing the vast military arsenals inherited from the Soviet era. We took seriously the provisions of the UN Charter, setting peace-loving as a fundamental criterion for membership in this organization. We envisaged our region as an era of peace and prosperity. Without hesitation, we choose to become a non-nuclear state. We gave up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal in the hope of making the world a safer place. And while we do not regret the moral righteousness of this decision, we have learned a very harsh lesson from the Budapest Memorandum. A deal without viable and effective security guarantees is a bad deal. Meanwhile, Russia did the opposite, not only preserving Soviet-era stockpiles, but significantly expanding them. Today, as a result, Russia is capable of striking Ukrainian frontline positions and residential areas with thousands of guided aerial bombs every month. In 2024 alone, Russian aviation has launched 40,000 such bombs. Just imagine this figure on peaceful Ukrainian cities, on peaceful Ukrainian civilians. Moreover, Russia continues to escalate its weapons production, including ballistic and cruise missiles. Each month, Russia is capable of producing 40-50 Iskander missiles, 30-50 Kalibr missiles, and around 50 Kh-101 missiles. And these weapons do not just stay in stockpiles. They immediately deployed against Ukraine. But even this has not been enough for Moscow. That's why Russia engaged Iran and DPRK in its war against my country, thus making this conflict internationalized. What started an arms supplies has escalated further, with North Korean military units appearing in Europe and fighting against a European nation. And I'm glad to note that today's UNGA resolution adopted is having a reference to the DPRK involvement in this terrible war. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russia has suffered staggering losses: hundreds of thousands of soldiers, over 10,000 tanks and 22,000 artillery systems, 370 aircraft, and more than 12,000 multiple launch rocket systems. The Black Sea Fleet has lost 28 vessels, including its flagship. What remains of it is now forced to seek refuge, not even in the occupied ports of Crimea, but in the Russian ports itself. These outcomes are the result of two factors: the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the solidarity and support of the international partners. We feel this support and we are very much grateful for it. Russia attacks both of these pillars because despite all of its advantage, it has failed to break Ukraine on the battlefield. It tries to crush our spirit, primarily through terror. That is why it targets critical infrastructure and residential buildings. That is why Russian soldiers are executing Ukrainian prisoners of war en masse. These execution-style killings must be investigated thoroughly by international organizations, and all those responsible must be brought to justice. Russia seeks to undermine global security with Ukraine, solidarity with Ukraine. Its vast propaganda machine spreads aggressive disinformation, attempting to discredit our country and sow doubt about Ukraine's ability to preserve its independence. Now Russia is pushing an entirely unworkable principle, negotiating about Ukraine without Ukraine, and packaging its harmful narratives in an appealing guise to this end. And let me be clear on behalf of Ukraine that there is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and there is nothing about Europe without Europe. Let me assure you that Ukraine wants peace more than anyone, but not any peace. As our President Volodymyr Zelensky stated, we need comprehensive, just and lasting peace with clear security guarantees. Otherwise, it will not work. To achieve this, we must intensify diplomatic efforts to establish a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter. It is in the interest of its entire humanity to secure such a peace this year. What Russia needs is not a peace, but a temporary pause in hostilities. Such pause would not bring peace. It would simply serve as a prelude to a larger war. Moscow needs time to replenish its losses, learn from its mistakes, and fine-tune its military economy. For 3 years, Ukraine has been saving time for others by withstanding the Kremlin's war machine. Our efforts and sacrifices must not be in vain. For that to happen, alliances built on shared values must be strengthened, not undermined. NATO and EU are indispensable elements of regional security, and Ukraine is eager to be part of them, not only as a security recipient, but as a security provider. And the Security Council, which bears the primary responsibility for maintaining peace and security, must live up to its mandate. Those responsible for the crime of aggression must not enjoy impunity. Sovereignty and territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders must be respected by all. We will continue to defend ourselves and strive for a fair and just peace consistent with the UN Charter. We know how to contain Russia, and our military has mastered the art of modern technological warfare. But however, we need to sustain this fight. We need more help from you. We need arms, air defense, technology, investment, tougher sanctions on Russia, and transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, and of course, political and moral backing. We must be mindful of the fact that this is existential war. This is existential war for the entire democratic world, for our democratic principles and values. And Russia has repeatedly tried to dismantle this rules-based order and our security architecture. It is impossible to stop the aggressor by appeasing. Appeasement doesn't work. Russia must implement the demands by the international community and withdraw its troops from the territory of Ukraine. Those responsible for the crime of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity must be brought to justice. We remain committed to the establishment of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against the Russian Federation. And let me reiterate once again, this war is existential. It's not only about Ukraine, it's not only about Europe, it's not only about region. It's about our global architecture. It's about rule-based order. It's about entire democratic world. Thank you so much.
感谢别查女士阁下的发言。我现在请波兰外交部长希克尔斯基先生发言。
President, colleagues, I address you today not just as the Foreign Minister of the democratically elected government of Poland, but also on behalf of the High Representative of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, to present the view of the European Union on Russia's illegal and unprovoked war against Ukraine. As has already been said, no one wants and needs peace in Ukraine more than the Ukrainians. No one has a larger stake in European security than us Europeans. And no one has greater power to end this conflict than Russia. All she needs to do is stop the killing and leave territories she illegally occupies. Only with these facts in mind can we work to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine, consistent with the UN Charter. On this tragic anniversary, our thoughts go out to the countless Ukrainians who have suffered. Their resilience is a testament to the unbreakable spirit of people who seek nothing more than their rightful place in the community of free nations. We must never forget the crimes committed by Russian troops in Borodyanka, Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and so many other places across Ukraine. The perpetrators must be held accountable. We should also acknowledge the far-reaching repercussions beyond Ukraine's borders. Russia's war has disrupted global food and energy markets. It has affected countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, thousands of kilometers away from Ukraine. And the people of Russia too. The Russian government has spent at least $200 billion of their taxpayers' money on this war. It will likely cost Russia over $1 trillion in previously anticipated economic growth by the end of next year. Imagine how many kindergartens, schools, and hospitals could be built for Russians, or for that matter, for countless other people around the world with such a fortune. But instead of building them, the Kremlin prefers to bomb them in Ukraine, while treating Ukrainians and its own people as collateral damage. As of this January, about 170,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. 600,000 more have been wounded. Russia's enablers must also be called out. The People's Republic of Korea is not only providing Muscovy with weapons, but also with troops. Iran is sharing its Shahed drones. Colleagues, the right way forward remains. Russia should immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its forces from Ukraine's territory. We as Europeans will continue to stand side by side with Ukraine to achieve a just and lasting peace. Peace through strength, the only kind Kremlin respects. Finally, I'd like to dedicate to this Council a maxim authored by my predecessor as Foreign Minister of Poland, a survivor of Auschwitz and of Stalinist prisons, Professor Władysław Bartoszewski. When you are in doubt how to behave, behave with decency. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
我感谢希克尔斯基先生阁下的发言。下面我请拉脱维亚外交部长布拉泽女士阁下发言。
Mr. President, I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. I thank the Presidency of the Council for convening this meeting and I thank the Undersecretary General, Ms. De Carlo, for her comprehensive briefing detailing Russia's attacks and crimes in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Today marks 3 years since Russia launched a full-scale, illegal, and unprovoked invasion of its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine. 3 years ago, Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, blocked this council from taking action mandated by the UN Charter to uphold peace and security. 3 years ago, the International Court of Justice ordered Russia to stop its military activities in Ukraine. It has not complied. 3 years on, as we stand, Ukraine has stopped Russia, a nuclear-armed state of 100 million, from realizing its imperialistic goals. Russia has failed to break the resolve of 40 million Ukrainians protecting their homeland. The Baltic states welcome all of its efforts to bring a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace for Ukraine. A peace that is rooted in the principles of the UN Charter and international law. A peace that guarantees Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and freedom to choose its alliances and future. A peace that stops the brutal Russian aggression for good, with no opportunities for resurgence. In principle, peace is easy to achieve. Russia needs to stop fighting. Then it's the end of the war. If Ukraine stops fighting, it's the end of Ukraine. Russian aggression against Ukraine began in 2014 with Russia's illegal occupation and annexation of Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine and the launch of direct military intervention in eastern Ukraine. Russia has waged a brutal colonial war aimed at destroying Ukraine's statehood, language, identity, and seizing its resources and territory in violation of the UN Charter and international law. The Baltic states' support of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders is unwavering and unconditional. It reflects our conviction that self-defense of Ukraine is also the defense of our common global security and common future, where might does not make it right. Borders must not be altered by force, and we will never recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, or any other region of Ukraine. And the aggressor has no prerogative to decide which options Ukraine, as sovereign nation, may consider in shaping its future. Ukraine does have right to exercise self-defense, clearly provided for in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Therefore, countries providing aid to Ukraine, including military aid, are not party to the conflict. Mr. President, we emphasize that only Ukraine's victory can ensure lasting security and put an end to Russia's imperialistic aggression. We strongly believe that a rushed ceasefire will not lead to sustainable peace. Instead, it will embolden Russia and maybe others, encouraging further expansion and putting global security at grave risk. We must defend the principles of the UN Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of further wars. Ukraine has endured unimaginable suffering, as documented in the briefing of USG De Carlo. Thousands of lives lost, millions of people displaced, entire cities destroyed to rubble. Permanent damage made to its natural environment, while constant attacks are made on its energy infrastructure. Atrocities endured by the people of Ukraine leave deep scars that will persist for generations. And still, Ukrainians stand strong and resilient, its democracy thriving, parliament working. They are defending their land and values that also uphold the UN Charter and global security. We must remain united and determined in providing long-term support to Ukraine. Global efforts to provide aid, assistance in reconstruction, and supporting displaced populations is a priority. Because this is not an isolated, localized war, nor is it just a European issue. Its consequences are felt across the globe, affecting the food security, energy security in some of the world's most vulnerable regions. According to several estimates, the war that Russia launched against Ukraine has already cost about 2% of the global GDP. 2% of the global GDP. Injustice and impunity in one place embolden efforts to undermine international law elsewhere. So Russia must be held accountable for its aggression against Ukraine. Failure to act will undermine the prospects for a just and lasting peace, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere. Mr. President, the so-called root causes that we heard today of the wars at Russia's imperial colonial ambitions, that is the root cause. Russia seeks to restore its imperial sphere of influence and change international order. Russia wants to decide the future and choices of sovereign countries and people, not only in Europe, but in other continents as well. We should not let it happen. We call for action by all countries, parliaments, governments, societies, to significantly increase assistance to Ukraine. Political, economic, humanitarian, military, all types of assistance, because we must stand with Ukraine in this existential fight, in line with the UN Charter. Then peace, lasting and just peace, could be achieved. I thank you. Slava Ukraini.
感谢布拉泽女士阁下的发言。我现在请芬兰外交国务秘书拉亚拉先生阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. The United Nations was built on the shared understanding that no effort should be spared in pursuit of peace. Yet, today we mark the third anniversary of arguably the most egregious violation of the UN Charter since its adoption, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia's aggression against Ukraine affects us all. It has brought about growing economic instability and soaring food prices in countries far from the battlefields. It has required attention and resources that could have otherwise been used to support people in need elsewhere. Most critically, it has undermined our system of collective security enshrined in the UN Charter. Russia is trying to destroy and dominate a democratic neighboring country and alter borders by using force. Russia attacks international law and the fundamental principles of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. Therefore, it is existential for us all to uphold these principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Mr. President, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine with its brutal and relentless warfare continues to cause immeasurable human suffering. According to the UNHCR, almost 7 million people have become displaced in Ukraine, and 3.7 million have been forced to flee from their homeland. Russia's systematic attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure deepen the plight of civilians every passing day. Civilians' access to water, electricity, and heating is severely limited amidst freezing winter weather. We are appalled by the treatment of thousands of children who have been unlawfully deported or transferred by Russia. These children must be immediately returned to their families. Russia must comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law, including by ending its attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure and ensuring humanitarian access. It is untenable that more than 75 years since the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war are violated at every turn by Russia. The Nordic countries are committed to seek full accountability for the numerous violations of international law. Russian leadership must be held accountable for the atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine and the crime of aggression. Mr. President, this morning, the General Assembly took a decision to support just and fair peace in Ukraine. The Nordic countries are proud to have voted in favor of both of these important resolutions. We know Ukrainians as people who want peace. They wish to go on with their lives and keep on building their beautiful, brave nation. We also know Ukrainians as people who love freedom. The freedom to speak their mind, elect their leaders, and choose their international alliances. It is the duty of this Council to advance both of these goals, that Ukraine can live in peace and uphold its full sovereignty in accordance with the UN Charter. Like all peace-loving nations, Ukraine deserves peace, a peace that is comprehensive, just, and lasting. Ukraine must be part of any negotiation for peace. Russia's aggression against Ukraine undermines not only the security in Europe, but also the stability across the world. Any solution for a lasting peace will necessitate a strong European involvement. Without it, peace runs at high risk of being short-lived. We all have a collective interest to prevent resurgence of violence and destruction in Ukraine as well as anywhere else in the world. Mr. President, the Nordic countries support a search for a just peace. In the meantime, we remain determined to continue our significant military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. In closing, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to support Ukraine as long as needed. Thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢拉亚拉先生阁下的发言。我现在请捷克外交部副部长胡利丘斯先生发言。
Mr. President, thank you. 8 years ago, after the Second World War, our wise predecessors enshrined in Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations the very basic principle of peaceful coexistence among nations. They prohibited the use of force by any state against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. And on 24 February 2022, Russia has violated this very fundamental principle of international peace when it launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, escalating a conflict it started with the occupation of Crimea and Donbass in 2014. Since then, it has been shamelessly attempting to steal the territory of a neighboring state through a war of aggression. And for that, Russia must be called to account and not rewarded. For all the victims of the Russian massacres in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, or Borodinka, for all the victims of this unprovoked and unjustifiable war, Kremlin must be held accountable and bear responsibility for the destruction and suffering it deliberately caused in Ukraine. This war is not only about Russia and Ukraine. This concerns us all. The ultimate victory of Ukraine means victory of the rule of law and respect for others, while its defeat would allow lawless brutality to prevail. The consequences would reverberate around the world for many years to come, undermining the very foundations of this organization and security globally. Mr. President, Czechia remains committed to supporting Ukraine's desire for peace. Peace that respects Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Peace that clearly distinguishes between the victim and the aggressor. Peace that is just and lasting. If Russia and its President Putin claims that their wish to end this war is sincere, then there is one simple way to prove it: send Russian soldiers back home. The solution of this war is that simple. Mr. President,
My country has its own tragic experience with imperialism and expansionism, also from side of Russia. We therefore feel a strong solidarity with Ukraine and its people, and we will stay side by side with them for as long as it takes, until just peace in line with the UN Charter and agreed by Ukraine, not imposed on it, is restored. Thank you.
感谢胡里丘斯先生的发言。下面我请罗马尼亚外交国务秘书赫里斯泰亚先生各家发言。
Mr. President, Madam Undersecretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Romania welcomes your decision to have this meeting today and for allowing me to take the floor. And I would like also to join the previous speakers in presenting our gratitude for the report presented by Madam Undersecretary General. While it marks a bleak anniversary, today's session keeps the situation in Ukraine on the Council's agenda. The Council must absolutely remain seized on this matter, since it is this body envisioned as a guarantor of international peace and security and acts on behalf of the United Nations whole membership. Ukraine remains very important for the global community, though the complex impact of this war at global level, including the dramatic aggravation of the food insecurity. Romania has demonstrated its solidarity with Ukraine and with the Ukrainian people. We firmly support Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty. We have welcomed Ukrainians fleeing the war and granted temporary protection status to over 230,000 people. We have facilitated the transit of over 55 million tons of Ukrainian grains to global markets, and we have provided emergency energy support for Ukraine upon request. Since day one of the start of the war, we have advocated for a just, sustainable, and inclusive peace in Ukraine, based on the United Nations Charter and the international law. Any resolution on Ukraine put on the table at the United Nations should be necessarily based on this idea. Any peace talks must include Ukraine. Since peace in Ukraine impacts European security, any solutions affecting the European security architecture should be drafted with the Europeans at the table. It is obvious that any post-conflict arrangements will have systemic implications for the entire Black Sea region. Considering the importance of ensuring security and freedom of navigation on the Black Sea and Romania's geographical position, my country is legitimately interested in the parameters of a future peace in Ukraine. For the reasons stated above, Romania has also been advocated for and supporting measures to consolidate the resilience of our neighbor, the Republic of Moldova. Last but not least, a just peace cannot be attained without justice and holding all those responsible accountable. Romania is part of the efforts to establish the best possible international tribunal for sanctioning the aggression committed against Ukraine in violation of a fundamental norm of international law, the prohibition of use of force. Ukraine is therefore entitled to the strongest reply in terms of judicial accountability. This should serve as an example of compliance with the United Nations Charter and discouragement for any such future actions from any other state. Mr. President, there are three brief points that I would like to add in conclusion, and they reflect the spirit of the Chinese presidency signature event organized last week on practicing multilateralism. The Council, who according to the Charter acts on our behalf, should precisely act and defend the United Nations Charter because the illegitimate and brutal attack against Ukraine continues 3 years since it has been launched. The Council should act and defend the United Nations Charter because the aggressor, the Russian Federation, is a permanent member of this body. And third, the Council should act and defend the United Nations Charter because this aggression undermines, with every passing day, the rules-based multilateralism, violating the United Nations Charter and the international law, including the international humanitarian law. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Mr. President.
感谢赫里斯泰亚先生的发言。我现在请荷兰乌克兰问题特使斯豪滕女士阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo for her briefing. Mr. President, in the cold light of day, 3 years after Russia's large-scale, unprovoked and illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we face a bleak and harsh reality, in which, if we do not act now, might is right. We cannot have the aggressor impose a deal on the victim, an aggressor who continues to intensify its attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Saturday's large-scale drone attacks do not show an intention by Russia to end this war. We cannot let a blatant violation of the UN Charter, a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, stand. This would create a dangerous precedent for the future, undermining the principles of international law and the sovereignty of all nations. Ukraine needs to be an equal partner in the negotiations. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And as the security of Europe is directly impacted, Europe should be involved too. Only inclusive negotiations can lead to a just and a lasting peace. Mr. President, this war must end, not just for the sake of Ukraine and Europe, but for the sake of the world. Russia's aggression has had devastating and long-lasting consequences for food security, for the environment, and for nuclear security. The Kingdom of the Netherlands calls on all countries that are enabling Russia's aggression to stop providing Moscow with a lifeline to prolong this unjust war. We call on all member states to help find a just, a lasting, and a comprehensive peace for the Ukrainian people, in accordance with the UN Charter. Changing borders by force must not be rewarded. We must uphold the Charter or risk living in a world where might is right. Thank you.
我感谢斯豪滕女士阁下的发言。现在发言名单上没有其他人，现在休会。